Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for this very informative and important event. My name is Mubashara Tazamal. I'm the Associate Director of The.Bridge.Initiative. Today, we're going to be discussing Islamophobia online, specifically looking at the issue with the campaign and election of Zohran Mamdani. Mamdani recently made history by becoming the Democratic mayoral candidate for New York City. Running on a bold, progressive platform, including policies like rent freezes and free public transit, his campaign resonated with working class New Yorkers. Yet his candidacy also became a target for a surge of online hate, driven largely by his Muslim identity. According to a recent report from the Center for the Study of Organized Hate, Islamophobic posts skyrocketed from an average of 56 to over 2,100 per day during the days surrounding the election. The report highlighted how online discourse around Mamdani and Muslim communities was shaped by a toxic convergence of Islamophobia, ideological fear-mongering, and xenophobic rhetoric. This alarming rise in anti-Muslim content also included inflammatory posts from prominent U.S. politicians, evidence of how deeply entrenched and normalized Islamophobia has become within mainstream political discourse. Today, we'll be discussing this report and the broader topic of Islamophobia online with our expert panelists. We'll start with a short presentation from each of them, and then we'll move into a moderated Q&A where I'll ask each a few questions. And lastly, we'll open it up to an audience Q&A, so please use the chat function to ask any questions. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists, and then we'll go into the presentations. Firstly, we have Dr. Maha Hilal, who is a Muslim Arab American expert on institutionalized Islamophobia, the war on terror, and counter-narrative work. She's the author of the book Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11, and the founding executive director of Muslim Counterpublics Lab. We have Rakib Hamid Naik, who is the executive director of the Center for the Study of Organized Hate, a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C. He's also a fellow with the Human Rights Project at Bard College in New York. And lastly, we have Dr. Saher Salod, who's the director of research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, a research institute that conducts research on American Muslims. Her research expertise centers on the experiences of Muslims and racism, Muslims with racism and surveillance. She's the author of Forever Suspect, Racialized Surveillance of Muslim Americans in the War on Terror, and co-author of A Global Racial Enemy, Muslims and 21st Century Racism. Thank you all for being here. We'll start with Maha, then we'll move on to Rakib, and lastly, we'll have Saher for the presentations.
Okay, well, thank you, Mubashara, for the introduction. And thank you to the Bridge Initiative for initiating this conversation. Thank you to the Center for the Study of Organized Hate, to Rakib and Sahar, who I'm very excited to be with today on this panel. So I'm going to share a quick Canva presentation just to kind of orient us, and I'm sure my amazing panelists will have a lot more to add, but just to sort of orient how I kind of observed and analyzed the situation in terms of the context with Zohran Mamdani. So I wanted to start with this tweet. I guess it's on his Truth Social, so it's not technically a tweet, whatever it's called, where Donald Trump, talks about the fact that the Democrats have, quote, crossed the line, and Zohran Mamdani is a communist lunatic. Of course, this is very interesting because the Democrats do not endorse, by large, right, Zohran Mamdani. But nevertheless, he's basically using his platform, again, to demean and diminish Zohran Mamdani, and also throws in communist, because, of course, now that these economic systems are being sort of increasingly used, at least in the discourse, whether or not Americans understand what they are is another story. This is a way to create and cultivate fear, not just, of course, around his Muslim identity, but also an economic system, which, of course, Trump is purporting Zohran Mamdani ascribes to. So this is, obviously a big problem in terms of the president of the United States really setting the stage and the tone for a lot of the political conversations that are being had. And once again, right, really modeling what is considered acceptable treatment of Muslims. So when we talk about Islamophobia, I know that there are many definitions of Islamophobia. I know that other scholars refer to what I'm describing as Islamophobia as anti-Muslim racism or anti-Muslim bigotry. Obviously, that's a discussion on its own, and is very worth discussing, of course. But I just wanted to talk just a little bit about how I conceptualize Islamophobia, and in particular how it really ties into what we're looking at with Zohran Mamdani. Sorry, I don't know, my computer's being really sensitive today. So the main points of this definition, which comes from my book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim, is that this fear and hatred of Muslims is constructed and contrived. A lot of times people don't like the use of Islamophobia because of the word, the part that is phobia, which often means an inherent fear of something. So in my definition, I'm specific about really talking about the constructed and contrived fear. And obviously, the state and the media do a very good job of cultivating fear of Muslims. And so, what's the point of this? It's really to justify repression and war and the targeting of Muslims. It's also based on specific social constructions. The report got into this as well. What are some of the constructions of Muslims that are being peddled constantly, right? So, this idea that Islam and Muslims are violent, barbaric, uncivilized, of course, opposed to normative democratic values, which is a key issue when we're talking about a political candidate and operating in the political sphere. And what happens with Islamophobia, of course, is that mistreatment and targeting becomes normalized because Muslims are pushed outside of these moral boundaries, such that what is seen as fair or just to one's internal community is not applied to Muslims. So when we're looking at the discourse, it's not just about demonizing Muslims in terms of language, but consequences of that language. And then finally, of course, Islamophobia is a pretty complex phenomenon. I mean, again, this deserves a discussion on its own, but really it's, particular type of oppression that I see is rooted in anti-religious animus because it specifically targets the religion itself and intersects with Muslims' identities because they're a very heterogeneous community, whether we're talking about anti-Blackness, racism, cultural racism, nationalism, and xenophobia. Just quickly, these narratives on Islamophobia come from this counter-Islamophobia kit briefing. You can see that a lot of these, again, are very relevant to the types of narratives that were deployed when it came to Zohran Mamdani. So, for example, threat to security, he's unassimilable, right? He is a threat to his identity is a threat to the identity of the United States or the identity of Western democracy, right? He's an incomplete citizen. People have questioned, for example, he just came 7 years ago. He's a citizen now, but how is he running? How could he possibly be running for mayor of New York City? And of course, he's intolerant, according to this narrative, which is very consistent, right, to other religions and ethnicities. And we see this a lot when the use of anti-Semitism is being weaponized and leveraged against Mamdani. One other thing I want to ground this discussion in is really what we call agnotology or the epistemology of ignorance. And I think it's really an important concept, and it may seem a little tangential here, but bear with me. What it really helps to explain is, that there's a lot of propaganda when it comes to different marginalized groups, of course, Muslims included. And part of why Americans believe the things that they do is because there's an active production of ignorance, such that, for example, Islamofascism becomes a term that isn't questioned, but seemingly has some sort of meaning that is on its surface, people can understand. And it's this way of sort of describing the world and withholding information to produce constantly ignorant subjects. And when we produce ignorant subjects, it becomes easier to throw out these terms like Islamofascism, communist, socialist, whatever they combine, sort of like this economic system with a religion. And so it's really important to think about the role of ignorance in all of this and what is being perpetuated in the scope of Islamophobia. When we talk about the Muslim threat, and this is something that came up in the report as well, the idea of moral panic. The most frightening thing, right, to people that are kind of operating within the lens of national security and post 9/11 context is this idea that there's violent Muslims that are in this country, right? That are bent on destroying this country, whose values are antithetical to the United States, who don't belong here, right? And who want to impose their way of life onto others. So this idea of moral panic comes from Stanley Cohen. And it's really just this idea that, there's a group that comes to be sort of uplifted or amplified as, existing um, in a way that is, of course, negative and which we can attribute certain social problems to, right? And we see that all the time. So, what is the goal of cultivating all of this fear around Zohran Mamdani, right? It's to make sure that there's an overreaction to his identity as a Muslim and to ignore, of course, what his political platform actually is. And that is a very key reason why moral panic is being generated. Now, there's also this idea of political moral panics, and this is what's generated by the state and moral entrepreneurs. So you can think of moral entrepreneurs as Laura Loomer or all of these people that have a vested interest in tying certain social problems to particular groups, such as Muslims. And this poses then and creates a political moral panic. And obviously, when it comes to a Muslim running for mayor and assuming a position in one of the largest cities in the United States, it becomes important, right, for individuals who want to see this, really who want to reject this, who want to stop this from happening, to generate these political moral panics. And if we look at the war on terror more generally, we can see it, as this author describes, as a campaign of emotional management. So a lot of the tweets that were captured in the report are really about scaring people, are really about entrenching ideas as Muslims, as being sort of these ends that are here again to infiltrate our society, to cultivate violence, to impose a certain rule upon us, upon the rest of the society. And so we have to think about the ways in which, again, these specific tactics, these narrative structures are being used to manage our emotions such that we become, for example, invested in the identity of the person as opposed to what their platform is. And this is a recurring theme when you look at the ways in which Mamdani and his political platform had been constructed, where there's less, of course, where there's no mention for those who want to demonize him of what his platform actually is, but rather what his identity represents and what they want his identity to be constructed as. Moreover, it's very interesting that, in these two tweets, again from the report, both are talking about the 9/11 attacks. And, the one on the left-hand side, Charlie Kirk, specifically identifies a number of people that were killed on 9/11. And Laura Loomer is asking for people not to forget, right? Or saying that they did forget about the 9/11 victims. And we're talking about 24 years ago, right? And the interesting thing is that we know at this point in time, at this juncture in history, that millions of Muslims have been killed as a result of the war on terror. And yet we're still primed to think only about what happened to the United States on September 11th, 2001. And of course, with that is collective responsibility squarely being placed on Zohran Mamdani, right? And it's, again, this emotional management, right? When you see Zohran Mamdani, don't think about rent freezes, don't think about how he's going to help with unemployment or childcare. You should think about what happened on 9/11 because he is a descendant of that violence. And so what I talk about in my book is sort of this idea that the United States is consistently and constantly the victim, right? And it really does not matter what happens either before that or after that. The United States always assumes this hegemonic posture of victimhood. And we're still at the point where we aren't able to adjudicate any of this, right? And it's rare that, anything that Zohran Mamdani would ever say about 9/11 would be considered acceptable in terms of what discourse we've come to sort of unfortunately acquiesce to or be forced to challenge. So one of the ideas in here, if you look at all the tweets and the way that the Zohran Mamdani has been constructed, as well as just Muslims in general, I mean, you can see very similar ideas coming out of the critiques of Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, right? Is this idea of stealth jihad? So, this is particularly resonant and relevant, right? When we're talking about a Muslim actually being part of the political system, right? And it's exponentially more scary because not only are Muslims existing in society alongside other communities, but then what they're really trying to do, of course, is again to impose their belief system, to impose their way of life onto others within the societies, and specifically through, right, quote, infiltrating these institutions and these bodies, right? So, in other words, Muslims who participate in political systems and political institutions cannot be seen as being there because they genuinely want to make change for their community, for their society, for the betterment of the American public, but instead there always has to be this stealth or hidden agenda. And that's a narrative that's constantly being woven throughout the ways that Zohran Mamdani, among other political candidates that are, both Muslim and not Muslim, are constructed. And one of the important things here as well is the idea that, you know, when these national security narratives are being perpetuated consistently, they come at the expense of Americans or whoever it is, right? In this case, the author is talking about Americans. Really, what are the ways that their sort of injustices are impacting their daily lives? What are the ways that they don't have, interventions from the government to address poverty or homelessness or whatever it is, right? But instead of thinking about those issues, this as this author says, the counter terror state exists and really tries to construct all of this as inevitably more important to pay attention to, such that then we see the platform or the campaign of Zohran Mamdani. What he's saying is New York is too expensive. That simply becomes a non-issue or a much less important issue because what people are primed to think is important is our national security, and that can only be maintained by demonizing Muslims and excluding them from the political sphere. Am I or at time? Okay, should I stop here?
Yeah, Mahad. We'll get into this in the Q&A because you brought up some really good points and really great at contextualizing what we're to here discussing in terms of the broader outside of just social media. This is a much broader conversation, and I really appreciate you going into talking about the terminology and how this is constructed because I think that's so important for our audience to understand that this doesn't just come out of nowhere. That is a phenomenon. That is what Islamophobia, I think there's a special phenomenon about it, is that it is constructed and contrived, like you said, primarily by those in power, such as the media and politicians. So we'll get into that when we move into the Q&A, but thank you so much, Maha. Now we'll have Rakib, please go ahead.
Well, yeah, thank you so much to you and the Bridge Initiative for bringing us all together for this important and very timely conversation. To begin with and kind of, place things in broader perspective, I think since the start of this ongoing war in Gaza, we have seen a massive surge in digital hate across all the major social media platforms, including X, YouTube, Meta-owned platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and of course Telegram and several other smaller networks, both in terms of hate but also censorship. And these spaces have kind of, become very saturated with anti-Muslim vitriol, kind of, directed with particular intensity at Muslim Americans in the American context. And this is indeed not a new phenomena. Online Islamophobia at the scale we are seeing today has been steadily building up for many years in the US and globally. And it is driven largely by this network of organized hate groups and individuals and leaders and far-right extremist movements spanning different continents, including North America, Europe, the UK, look at Australia, and India, which of course I'll talk about later as well, who use social media platform as converging spaces and funnels to circulate these very harmful narratives targeting minorities across borders, but Muslims more so. And since 2023, we have seen an intensification of that pattern, which has been kind of supercharged by these different wars in the Middle East and amplified by, of course, platform algorithms. Specifically, X is a very good case study, but others kind of have followed the very similar pattern. And kind of these narratives have been made very dangerous by the speed and reach of this digital virality, as well as the inaction of platforms, and some led by executives who themselves play a very critical role in promoting hate and amplifying the far-right extremist networks. And Elon Musk, undeniably, is the most prominent example in this particular case. But there are many other tech executives who also play a very big role in what we are seeing, this surge of Islamophobia in the US context today. And in May, we published a report on Musk and X's role in promoting a surge of Islamophobia targeting British Muslims, British Pakistanis, and immigrants through moral panics around, quote unquote, the grooming gangs. Um, and at CSOH, we monitor these trends to understand how organized hate operates online, who it targets, and how vulnerable communities are impacted as a result of this hate. And as part of this work, we track these harmful narratives on these platforms that could have put Muslim communities at risk during the recent mayoral primary in New York. And we also kind of were trying to examine how foreign influence ops in the online space were evolving as the primary election date neared in June. And long before even the primary results were announced, we kind of saw a very steady rise in online hate directed at Mamdani and more so broadly at Muslims because of his faith. And for our study that we published the report, we observed the period from June 13th to June 30th. And during most of this window, the daily volume of posts with harmful keywords about Mamdani and Muslims ranged anywhere between 44 and 263. But on the day of the primary results, the number spiked to 899. That was June 24th. And in the following 24-hour, it's more than kind of doubled. To 2,173 posts. And for the next 5 days, the daily average remained around 800 posts, which kind of, this entire surge illustrates how moments of political visibility for Muslim candidates can trigger sudden and concentrated waves of online Islamophobia. And our analysis also revealed several overlapping narratives driving this hate. Maha talked about some of them. Um, Islamophobia, of course, was the central tenet of this entire narrative that costed Mamdani's faith as inherently violent, using tropes such as quote unquote Sharia takeover, radical Muslim candidate, brown Muslim jihadist, or as Maha mentioned, invoking the 9/11 attacks to claim that the city hall, the mayoral office would be infiltrated by quote unquote Islamic extremists. And we also saw a pervasiveness of posts that used ideological red baiting that framed his democratic socialist politics as a communist extremism. And it was often fused with anti-Muslim stereotypes like Muslim communist. And then we also tracked posts that involved nativist attacks that questioned his very right to live in and live in the United States, let alone represent the people. And these harmful narratives were part of this larger global hate amplification network that we have seen repeatedly converge across platforms. And in this particular context, it featured MAGA supporters like Charlie Kirk, Laura Loomer, Amy Mack, and then we had these far-right actors from Europe, mostly on X, accounts like Visegrad 24, Radio Guinea, which has almost 1.4 million people, and both of these accounts are extensively retweeted and promoted by Elon Musk himself. And then from the UK, we had Tommy Robinson and other EDL supporters and leaders, as well as other white supremacist groups and accounts from North America and Europe. But then we also found interesting convergence of this multiracial far right that included Hindu nationalist networks and influencers from India, and some of whom were also linked to Prime Minister Modi's party. So the Indian connection was especially revealing because we had seen even like almost 3 weeks before the elections that Hindu nationalist X accounts were consistently pushing content that targeted Mamdani because of his criticism of Prime Minister Modi and being very outspoken on the persecution of religious minorities in India. And this Indian context that I'm going to talk about right now, we didn't publish these findings as a standalone report. We shared them with the New York Times, which reported on these findings a few weeks ago. And our research uncovered efforts by these Hindu nationalist X accounts in India that try to influence the mayoral primary. And these accounts consistently put out posts with Islamophobic narratives and disinformation that was aimed at shaping the public opinion about Mamdani, but also mobilizing Hindu American voters to vote particularly against this particular candidate, painting him as an anti-Hindu, anti-India candidate. And the majority of this content, whether Islamophobic or this India originating content, it was posted mostly on X platform, which accounted for nearly 2/3 of the posts that we tracked. And its speed, reach, and capacity for virality is unmatched. In fact, some of the posts that were initially made on X, later on, we found them shared by people across various other platforms. So X was a very central vector of this online hate and Islamophobia that we saw recently in the case of Mamdani, but in general, all the different studies that we are conducting across regions, across continents, we are finding X becoming a prominent space of convergence for all these far-right extremist hate actors. And to this, I think we must remember the problem with online hate is that it never stays online. History and recent events have shown us that that digital hate often spills over into offline violence. And there are many, many recent examples. And the line between this online incitement and real world harm is literally razor thin. And when this kind of hate that we saw recently after the primary results is normalized in public discourse, this risks the targeted communities becoming the risk of the targeted communities becoming victims is immediate and deadly. And to that concern, our report has offered several recommendations to the tech platforms to mitigate these harms and to ensure that Muslim communities can engage in civic life without fear of harm. And I will stop here, and I'll look forward to answering many other questions during the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Rakib. I really appreciated you noting that, this originally starts out with these tech platforms, especially in the last 2 years, we've seen aren't neutral, and they are shadow banning. Their algorithms are shaped in a certain way where Islamophobic content is amplified, and content revealing the genocide going on in Gaza is shadow banned. It's limited. So I think that is a very important point to recognize, that these tech platforms are also part of this entire issue that we're facing. And the last part about online hate, it doesn't stay online. And we've had here in the UK multiple incidences where online hate and online disinformation has caused anti-Muslim riots. And in India, this is a really, really, really horrendous problem. And I know, Rocket, you definitely look at that. So I'd be happy to get into that in the Q&A. Seher, you're our last presentation.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for the invitation to participate in this very important conversation. And I also want to thank you all for writing this report. Everybody read it. It's a great report. I think it highlights a lot of things that we need to really be thinking about. So I think my presentation will touch on Maha and Rakib's presentations a little bit, and then maybe I'll end with some comments that I have, like as an academic who's written about surveillance and the racialization of Muslims. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of data that we had that might help understand and unpack what's in the report. At the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, we conduct polls on American Muslims. And so we are in the process, we're about to release our 7th American Muslim poll in October. It'll be the 2025 one. In it, we ask questions about experiences with discrimination. We oversample Muslims in a Jewish population, but then we compare their experiences to the general public. So we're able to actually get at how people, where they rank in terms of this Islamophobia index. So I'm very grateful, Maha, sort of unpacked Islamophobia and what that means, but I can sort of, take from there that at ISPU on our survey, we actually have these 5 measures to create an index, and then we can see where are people, where do they fall on this index? So what it does is it takes these 5 measures, these ideas that we've seen since, really expanded on since 9/11, that Muslims living in the United States are more prone to violence. Most Muslims living in the United States discriminate against women. Muslims living in the United States are hostile to the United States, and they're less civilized. And then also, and this is an important one, that Muslims are partially responsible for acts of violence carried out by other Muslims, not even the acts of violence that they carry out themselves. This is all very important because it sort of shows you what's happening in this report with all of the attacks on Mamdani after the primary. So what we know based on this Islamophobia index and all these past polls is that this is bad for democracy and security. So we have noted that a higher Islamophobia index, if you rank higher on the Islamophobia index, you tend to have a greater acceptance of military targeting of civilians, a greater acceptance of individual targeting of civilians, a greater acceptance of authoritarian attitudes. I think that's very important in this moment, which means suspending checks and balances, limiting freedom of the press, and also greater support for discriminatory policies like the Muslim ban and surveillance of mosques. So it's not surprising when I read that report that Mamdani, when Mamdani was running, that he was the recipient of so much Islamophobic and anti-Muslim content on social media. we show that, if you look at all of our polls, and I think the 2025 data, which I can't share yet because we're still in the process of going through the data, but that we're going to see this number change, but that anti-Muslim experiences and discrimination against Muslims has largely remained unchanged across the polls that we've taken. So it's roughly around 60s to, 62%. So even though, we see that, we're looking at 20 some years post 9/11, that this hasn't really changed, that anti-Muslim sentiments and experiences with discrimination are continue to rise. And this is partially tied to what is in the report that we see on social media, the sort of like the Islamophobic rhetoric. But one of the things in the report that Rakib just pointed out is that was interesting, very interesting to me, is the part about Hindus and anti-Hindu, like him being accused as being anti-Hindu. So I'm going to kind of skip over this. When I'll talk about this in the Q&A about Muslim voter registration and that, because I think it responds to one of the questions Mubashir might ask me. We published a report in 2024 which looks at the role of Hindu nationalism in the United States. So in this study, we surveyed 600 Hindus in the United States and asked them a series of questions about, to identify whether or not they were sort of buying into this, if this Hindu ideology in India was seeping into the United States. And so what we found was that it was indeed, and this isn't on this slide, but it's really important to note that, of the Hindus that we surveyed, it's the third generation that we're seeing. So people who've never lived in India who are, sort of holding on to this Hindutva nationalist ideology. So we found that in our survey, we asked them if, questions about should they ban hijabs in public schools and universities, and about 38% strongly agreed or somewhat agreed that public schools in the US should ban the hijab, and that's more than the general public. We also found that Hindus in the sample said that I want to live in a country where no one is targeted for their religious identity. That was 22%, I'm sorry, 47% compared to 67% of the general population. When we asked them questions about infringement on rights of Muslims in the United States, we found that, Hindus in the sample were more likely to agree with that they wanted to surveil or surveillance program targeting mosques in the United States. So that was at 38% compared to only 25% of the general public. They were more likely to agree with the statement of banning the building of mosques in the United States over the general public at 38%. And a ban on visas to Muslims wanting to come to the United States, that 41% of Hindus in the samples agreed with that compared to 30% of the general public. So, Hindus who support Hindutva ideologies and ideas and policies, we discovered that they were more likely to also financially contribute to campaigns and things like that. So Hindu respondents who support these ideologies and policies, like the demolition of mosques, the Citizenship Amendment Bill in India, and the hatred of BJP, were more likely to contribute to political campaigns in the US. So I'm going to stop sharing there. I just felt like the report really brings to light some of these important issues, that it is indeed global, the sort of targeting of somebody like Mamdani, who's, being portrayed as not just anti-Semitic and a potential radical Islamist and a communist, as the report shows, but also we're starting to see this language around he's, anti-Hindu or Hinduphobic. And that's really important to pay attention to as we see Muslims running across the country for political office, that it's not just within the United States, it's actually a global effort to prevent them from running for office or winning these offices in the United States. So I'll stop there, and I know that I have more to respond to with Mubashira's questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sahar. I really appreciated obviously the data and the survey that ISPU has done. And I think you really answer the question with the survey, with the Islamophobia index of why should we care about this issue? It's bad for our democracy, it's bad for our security, it's bad for human rights, it's bad overall. And given the trajectory of where the country is headed, you can see the consequences and how damaging and dangerous they are. And also that last point, the report that you highlighted of Hindu nationalism in America, really important recognizing and highlighting Islamophobic sentiments amongst Hindu Americans. And the report also, I believe, talks about how Hindu American groups actively campaigned against Mamdani and utilized Islamophobic narratives in their campaigning. That actually leads me into one of my questions that I had for Rakib about this anti-Hindu kind of attacks against Mamdani. A smaller subset of the posts that you looked at that you found in the report framed Mamdani as anti-Hindu, showing transnational Hindu nationalist influence. How do these networks, both digital and organizational, coordinate across borders to shape narratives in U.S. political spaces?
Well, thank you for that question. And I think to start off, I would like to make one thing clear here. The data that we looked at, it is just the microcosm of the bigger issue at hand. We don't have access to the platform APIs. Twitter has shut it down. It's $40,000. We don't have that money to gain that access to the APIs to really get all the data that was out there. So this data just paints the picture of the broader campaign of online Islamophobia targeting Muslim candidates running for office in the US. Um, in the context of Hindu nationalist networks operating transnationally, um, uh, they kind of use social media platforms linking their Indian ecosystem with their supporters across Australia, the EU, the UK, the US, and Canada. And in case of Mamdani, hopefully I'll touch that base on this later. But they kind of, function both through these digital channels, these platforms, and well-established diaspora organizations. In the US, it's a whole lot of this parallel infrastructure of Hindu nationalist organizations that you would find in India. They've established a parallel infrastructure here in the US. All of them, most of them, they enjoy 990 501(c)(3) statuses. They are operating as nonprofit organizations in the realm of charity, advocacy, promoting culture and stuff. So a lot of this coordination kind of, happens openly on social media platforms, but also mobilizing does happen in closed groups on WhatsApp and Telegram. And on Telegram, we have seen such coordination. In fact, a few years back, I was added to this one group on WhatsApp by US and Canada-based Hindu nationalists on why they should work towards a campaign to ban halal products in North America because they were claiming this was supposedly the money proceeds from halal products were being used to fund terrorism. So most of these networks are part of ecosystems rooted in India, but kind of tailored to engage diasporic audiences and advancing narratives that align very well with the political priorities of India's far right and the ruling party, the BJP. As I mentioned earlier during my remarks, our focus on Mamdani initially, the mayoral campaign, was looking at the foreign influence operations online. And it was during that research that we uncovered this steady stream of posts from India that framed Mamdani as anti-Hindu and anti-India. It was mostly in the context of the one rally where he was at many years ago in New York. A a bunch of people who had gathered to protest against the building of this temple, grand temple, in place of the demolished Babri Mosque, which was demolished by Hindu nationalists in 1992. So after it was inaugurated, Mamdani was there, and there were some slogans that were chanted by people, but he was just right on the side doing the live stream, and Hindu nationalists just jumped on him, accusing him of what other folks said. It's kind of a straw man fallacy. But then also his comments around Modi, whom he openly criticized for unleashing this wave of hate and violence targeting Muslims in India. So that kind of didn't sit very well with Hindu nationalist groups in the US who represent the interests of this deeply Islamophobic and oppressive regime in India. And hence they collaborated, and as they usually do with any critic of Hindu nationalism, people. I think ISPU also had a campaign against it after it published that report. And I have personally been targeted over the last many years for my work on India. And in this particular context, they all converged on X and other platforms to spread Islamophobia and disinformation, aiming to sway public opinion against him and influence the Hindu American voters. And this particular example also exemplifies this broader pattern that local political contests in the West are becoming vehicles for Hindu nationalist networks to promote their narratives and cast Muslims running for office as hostile to Hindu, which does shape voter perceptions and feeds into this global ecosystem of Islamophobic messaging.
Thank you, Rocket. That actually goes into perfectly into my next question because we're talking about narratives and labels and how Hindu nationalists have adopted the larger Islamophobic narratives that have been promoted for a long time, and they've utilized it to push their own interests both in and outside of the US. Maha, this is actually for you. And you are an expert in this field, so that's why this question is coming to you about how have state-sanctioned frameworks for identifying, quote, threats shaped the language of today's digital hate campaign targeting Mamdani?
Thank you so much, Mubashara, and thank you to Sahar and Raka, because this presentation has been super fascinating. And so I think, when we talk about the 9/11 narrative, I mean, it's pretty much been the same narrative for the last 24 years. It was created to be a robust infrastructure in that, the protagonist and the antagonist were identified obviously very clearly. The reasons for the 9/11 attacks were identified very clearly, of course, because the quote terrorists here, freedom and democracy. And so when you create such a robust infrastructure, a narrative infrastructure, it's very easy to position and filter in new situations and new contexts through that infrastructure. And that's what has happened repeatedly, right? So we have all these narratives about Muslims being uncivilized, Muslims being barbaric, Muslims being violent, Muslims being inherently angry, and us not being able to, or people not being able to understand, right? It's inexplicable anger. And these are specific narratives and tropes that have been used since 9/11 and before, of course. We can go back to Orientalism. There's a lot of literature in terms of how Muslims have been constructed in the history of this country. But really see how they've been sort of entrenched post 9/11 in a lot of different ways. I included this quote here from an interesting article. Find the title. I can find the title later. Oh, it's called Islamophobia, Culture and Race in the Age of Empire. And, this is basically what the 9/11, post 9/11 narrative infrastructure has done, right? Everything that we want to explain away in terms of bad things can be explained away by attributing it to Islam, right? And when the narrative succeeds in doing that, then we need not find any other explanation for the ills of societies, the conditions and problems that the government is creating, right? You can see this cartoon on the other side, right? And it's, of course, Mamdani potentially becoming, the mayor of New York and flying a plane. Of course, what is he going to do when he flies his plane? Of course, he's going to run into the World Trade Center because that's the only thing that Muslims are capable of doing, right? They're not actually interested in governing the city or governing any polity. What they're interested in is inflicting massive violence because that is the only thing that they can do. And, a lot of this is obviously very lazy stereotyping because they're going back to the same ideas over and over and over again, despite the conditions that are changing around them. So, among I think the ideas of the very durable narratives, right? Again, we have this idea of civilization, of freedom. Everything changed post 9/11, right? Muslims are inherently hateful. There's always this good versus evil dichotomy. And when you have this dichotomy, right, it's very easy to place Muslims in the category of evil. And of course, whenever there's a Muslim involved, there has to be an existential crisis, right? 9/11 was an existential crisis. And what do we do when we need to solve an existential crisis, right? We need to remove the source. We need to extract the source of that existential crisis from the place where that existential crisis is threatening. And we can see this again with Mamdani, the way that he is being constructed, right, as an existential crisis to New York. We can go back to this slide for a second, where you see this woman, the Statue of Liberty, wearing a burqa. Marjorie Taylor Greene actually put out a tweet with this picture. And again, this is an existential crisis because who are we as a country if it becomes a Muslim country in which there are Muslim laws and Islam is governing the country, right? So it's consistently going back to these very similar themes. And, the last thing I'll say is really that, you know, when we look at the different ways that other countries have deployed this war on terror narrative, Israel has deployed it very intentionally in terms of executing their genocide against Palestinians. And not only does that serve Israel in terms of, positioning October 7th as sort of this day that changed everything, like 9/11 did for the United States, it also allows the United States to regurgitate once again the same tired narrative over and over about why 9/11 happened and who are the people who are to blame, i.e., Muslims, and what then are the appropriate interventions. And in this case, obviously, the appropriate intervention is not to allow Muslims into political life.
Thank you, Maha. That was a brilliant overview of how these stereotypes and tropes that we hear today are not new. It's not something revolutionary. It's tried and tested over and over again, definitely for the last 2 decades. And we as Muslims are so used to it, we can predict that this is a type of hatred and vitriol we'll get in the public space. And that moves me to my next question for Sahar. Mamdani is not the first Muslim American politician to face this intense hatred. We've seen it with Ilhan Omar, we've seen it with Rashida Tlaib, and we're actually seeing it again with Minneapolis mayoral candidate Omar Fattah. How does this persistent climate of political hostility shape both Muslim Americans' political engagement and the broader public's perception of them?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And that's sort of where those slides I skipped over because I knew that this might be one of the questions. I think that what we're seeing in the data, at least, is that as, so in 2018, that was the largest number of Muslims running for office that we saw in this country. And I don't think it's any surprise that that happened after Trump won in 2016. And so Trump ran on the most overtly anti-Muslim campaign, which ended up especially during the primary, it ended up influencing the other Republican candidates' rhetoric about Muslims. So, what's the response to that? There are multiple responses, but one of the things we see in the data is more Muslims are registered to vote and more Muslims actually voted who registered to vote. So not only were they registering, they were also actually voting. And so, we saw Get Out the Vote campaign for Muslims, prior to the 2020 election. Muslims were mobilizing in this country. And then just what we saw in 2024 with the Uncommitted campaign and the Abandoned Biden campaign, that is a true example of Muslim organizing around a political issue in this country and saying, we won't give you our vote. And it was, coming at a time when at that time before the election, these candidates were very concerned about swing states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, where, Biden won those by very, very, very narrow margins, And in those states, we had Muslims who voted, we know that voted in numbers that for Biden that he won. He won those states. So, both the Trump campaign and Biden and then the Harris campaign were concerned about these states and Muslims and how they were going to vote. So what we're seeing on the one hand is, this spike in anti-Muslim rhetoric, this, going back to Sharia law, which I was actually kind of surprised at, to Maha's point, it's the same old, it's the same old rhetoric. And you keep thinking, well, wasn't that 2010? Well, no, this report shows it's actually now 2025. Anti-Sharia is, still being used against Muslims. I mean, especially when they're running for office, they're going to come and take over. But the response is not like I think after 9/11, in the interviews I did with Muslims, the response was, maybe just, let's not put attention on us. Let's just try to, get by and not bring too much attention to us. And now the response is we're going to organize and we're going to respond by running for office, by combating some of this. So I think it's having the reaction of we're seeing more Muslims run for, more Muslims run for office. That's why we have Mamdani. That's why we have, in Minneapolis, we also have somebody running for U.S. Senate in this country who's a Muslim in Michigan. So, we're going to see more Muslims. We have more Muslim organizations that are invested in getting Muslims to run for office, So I think even while we see this incredible Islamophobic, we're seeing a counter to it. So, and this is it.
Yeah, so I actually recently read an article in The Nation by Spencer Ackerman who actually talked about this point where he said Mamdani's election for the first time showed how the Islamophobic campaign against him couldn't be successful, because he made the campaign about the issues. That's what he was talking about. He was talking about what the everyday New Yorker cared about. And whereas before it's often been used to divert attention, as some previously your presentations, all of them have mentioned this. Muslims are often scapegoated in terms of talking about real issues, especially from politicians. And Mamdani's campaign kind of turned that on its head. No matter how much his identity was used by opponents and by oppositional voices, he maintained his focus on the issues that New Yorkers cared about, which is it's uh it's a good thing for us to see in the sense that the public care about the everyday issue of my rent, my education, my transportation, my cost of living overall. And so it'll be interesting to see how elections going forth and how campaigns will take influence from how Mamdani presented himself. We've got two questions from our audience. They're not directed at anyone, so feel free, whoever wants to take this first one. How is Islamophobia different or similar to other moral panics in US history? For example, anti-Blackness, anti-Catholicism, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Is there anyone who wants to take that particular question?
I'll just go first because this is something I engaged with a lot in my work and as an academic, as I went out and gave presentations. And just to note, like in my work, I don't use the term Islamophobia. I use the term racialization. And the reason I do that in the academic work, I know it, the research org, think tank, advocacy space, I think Islamophobia is being widely used as the term. But the reason it kind of answers this question is that I think this has always been part and parcel of, the history of racism, whether globally or in the United States, which is tied to colonialism so, when it comes, they're not distinct. The anti-Muslim racism is not distinct from, it's different. We have to recognize the history of anti-Blackness in this country, but there are relationships and there are points of convergence where they influence, each other. So the Chinese Exclusion Act is where we saw the banning essentially of Muslims from the United States through these anti-immigration laws and policies that we saw historically, that the Chinese Exclusion Act is one of them. But in this moment, I just want to say, like, if we think about anti-Muslim racism, Islamophobia, if we look at our laws and policies that are put into place under this rhetoric that Muslims are a threat to the United States. So in my second book, I talk all about laws and policies and counterterrorism laws and policies, both in the United States and globally. They don't just impact Muslims. They actually have, in the United States, for example, they have a much larger impact on our undocumented population in this country. So ICE is the creation of 9/11. ICE was created because of 9/11 to protect the borders from another terrorist attack. So, this is something we really have to pay attention to. And it's also, the USA Patriot Act which was put into place after 9/11 under this guise of protecting the nation from terrorism, has been used in sneak and peek searches by local police departments looking for drugs and things like that. So the impact, the narrative around Muslims right now, they're the threat. We have to protect our borders. The laws and policies, though, have a much wider reach, and it's well beyond a Muslim population, which is really a small percentage of the US population. It actually impacts a lot of other racialized groups. So I'll stop there and let anyone else jump in.
I'll jump in. I think, the mechanisms of generating moral panics are the same. I mean, what it is really is about cultivating a fear around a certain group of people, right? And attaching them or attributing a particular social problem to that group of people. So in that sense, that mechanism is the same, right? When we saw the Japanese internment, right? What was the constructions of Japanese, right? That they were an existential threat, right? That they couldn't actually be American. And these are some of the very same themes, right, that are used against Muslims. So moral panics, there's a sort of a blueprint, right? There's a framework for how to cultivate these moral panics. And what differs is simply the constructions that are weaponized and deployed of different target groups based on, I think, what's resonant in society at a particular moment in time, right? We have the 9/11 attacks, and obviously there was a very robust storyline and narrative that was created around that, which allowed for certain constructions of Muslims to thrive. And that's the same when we talk about, for example, anti-Blackness and police brutality. There's a same set of constructions, right, that are propagated about Black people in terms of their, propensity to commit crime, et cetera, et cetera. And so attaching that identity to a particular social ill to generate this fear and suspicion of a particular community. I think just in general, I mean, the reason why this question is actually very important is because, when we talk about addressing state violence in all of its manifestations and throughout the US's history, it's really important to make these connections. Sahar mentioned that as well. It's really important to make these connections so that when we're addressing sort of a new chapter or what seems to be a new chapter of state violence by the United States, we're looking to the past in terms of how it's been utilized and deployed. And how it's been challenged, right? So part of the Japanese American experience was to, over time, try to deconstruct and reconstruct a different sort of narrative and construction of their identities, which eventually, over time, led to, not very good reparations or not really a very compelling acknowledgement by the US government, but it led to something. And so there are a lot of historical messages and ways we can understand moral panics and other similar instances of state violence. And the one thing I'll end with is, in my book, there's something I say very, I think passionately, which is that US wars don't end. They just preserve the brutality of wars past. So it's constantly recycling, and it just is a matter of who's being targeted at a particular time and how are those tactics from the past being used against different groups.
Thank you both so much. I also wanted to point out, Sahar, when you were talking about ICE and Patriot Act and these uh, post 9/11 policies and organizations that were created by the government. Another big one is Guantanamo. What was it last year when Guantanamo came back up in the news, and there's still Muslim men imprisoned at Guantanamo. It was originally the prison was created to house Muslim boys and men with the war on terror. Torture was central. Maha, you've talked about it heavily in your research. And now Guantanamo has been used to house undocumented individuals, immigrants that the or administration is targeting. And it exists outside of both like domestic and international law. So it serves as a kind of perfect hub for illegal activities. And so as you both have talked about, it's the same tactics that are utilized. It might be targeting one community today, but it will target other communities tomorrow. And that's why these are all so dangerous. And that's why we talk about this issue. Um, we have another question, and I think this is quite important when we're talking about digital hate. There have been state and national policies related to countering hate online. For example, California Senate Bill 771 or the Stop Hate Act. We do need to hold social media companies accountable for spreading any kind of hate, and we do not want any of those efforts to result in the targeting and silencing of Muslims, Arabs, and or anyone advocating for Palestinian human rights. How do you advise we navigate policies related to countering hate online? How do we, as a broader society, navigate the lines between free speech and hate speech? Is there anyone who wants to take that question?
I think I can take that question. Um, in the context of content moderation policies of social media platforms, they do have robust policies in terms of what constitutes violation of online platform policies. Each platform has very well coded definitions of how their moderation policies work. But the fact is also, after Trump came to power, some of the platforms have walked back on some of those policies, opening the floodgates of hate, targeting the most vulnerable members of our communities. But the problem is also with the industry in itself. It's a profit-driven industry. They don't give a damn about the users. They don't care about our safety, the safety of children, the safety of the most vulnerable members of our community. And their main objective is how to cut the cost and maximize their profits. And we have seen with with X specifically, uh, X gutted all its trust and safety teams and moved to the community notes model, which kind of uh, in the context of South Asia, we recently published a study. We looked at all the community notes that were written since its inception in 2023, like 1.8 million notes. And out of that, only 100,000 notes were published globally. And when we looked further down, how many of the published notes were written in South Asian languages, there was just 1,600. So so just imagine like 1.8 million notes never made it to the post. They never showed up alongside the post. And most of these posts we're talking about are misinformation, disinformation, they're hateful posts and stuff. And the problem here is this cost cutting mechanism for this profit driven industry that doesn't want to spend a single dollar on safety of those who use their platforms. Um, and um, and unfortunately, the reality is also the political and ideological shift in the Silicon Valley, which has driven this online hate. So to go back to the question, I think the policies are there, and it's just a question of implementation and the moderation, whether they have human moderators to moderate this speech, or most of their moderation practices rely on AI models. If they're on AI models, then who is training those models? That is also important questions. And with what bias is ingrained in those models, that is also very important. So, having said that, to the last part of your question, I think uh, the line, I mean, free speech and safety are not opposites. They both can be together at the same time. It's just a question that we need to draw a line, that when a speech that incites violence and discrimination shouldn't be allowed, because it causes real world harm to the communities, could manifest into multiple different forms. And as I said earlier during the remarks, online hate doesn't stay online. These algorithms, these addictive algorithms, recommender systems, they're radicalizing people. They're radicalizing people, and people who are radicalized, you never know what they will do. And in the US context, we have seen, it's just that we will continue to hear this rhetoric from these tech executives about quote unquote the free speech, the digital town square, and protecting the civilization and humanity. And again, this is all this far right rhetoric, the weaponization of the language of human rights and free speech to maximize their interests, maximize their profits. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much, Rakib. Is there anything anyone else wanted to add? We don't have any more questions. So if anyone else has anything else they'd like to add on the topic, I feel like we've covered so much in terms of contextualizing the conversation, providing historical context, also talking about language and rhetoric, and the consequences of this digital hate, where, like Rakib has said multiple times, it does not just stay online. And we've seen this around the world where online disinformation snowballs, and it creates a mob sort of effect, and that ends up on our streets and creates a very, very dangerous environment. And we've seen this, it's happened to Muslim communities in multiple areas around the world. And I think another big consequence of digital hate and online disinformation, especially when it comes to Islamophobia and racism, has been the genocide in Gaza. You can go online and you can see the level of dehumanization and the level of disinformation that is being promoted, not just by just a random Twitter user or a person. These are individuals with large platforms, and they're being retweeted and reposted by other individuals and organizations with large platforms. And sometimes it's coordinated, sometimes it's organic. But it just shows you that these virtual spaces that we all take part in influence our day-to-day lives and have consequences. And I think that's very important. And I'm so glad all of you could take part in this. Everyone, the presentations were brilliant. I'm going to tell our audience, please do follow all of these individuals on social media. Check out the report from the Center for the Study of Organized Hate. I did add it into the chat function. We will be publishing a recording of the event on our website, bridge.georgetown.edu. And really, really thank you all for taking the time out of your day to join us. Maha, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay, I just want to add a couple of quick things that I found interesting. I think when we're talking about all of this, right, we're talking about the ways in which, Muslims are being demonized, and how Islamophobia is inevitably going to impact, who decides to vote for Zohran Mamdani or any Muslim political candidate. And I think this quote really highlights one of the other threats that Mamdani really poses. And I think it really is an interesting way. It's sort of the opposite, right? It's that he is, it says, an outsider who finds belonging. And I think that this is really interesting because it's sort of in spite of all the ways that Islamophobia is meant to demonize him and demonize the Muslim community, in spite of all the ways that Muslims are told that they don't belong in the political establishment, much less this country, that then that is a specific right threat to the establishment, right? That they did not succeed, not just about, in terms of not getting people to vote for Mamdani, but also in getting Mamdani to withdraw because of the ways that he's being demonized. And you know, what this author also talks about is just that, this campaign, she says, is really powered by a multi-ethnic generation of New Yorkers. And it's not about his identity. And that shows the success of his campaign because all of the Islamophobic attacks are deployed for the purpose of people being distracted by his identity and turning away from the actual platform that he's putting forward, right? Whether it's about childcare, whether it's about housing, whether it's about employment. You're not supposed to think about that. You're supposed to think about who he is and the threat he poses. But this is why this campaign is so powerful. And if it's okay, I just want to show this quick. I think some of you may have seen it. It's one. I think Mamdani does a really brilliant job of really creating this sort of organic and very positive and sort of lighthearted counter narrative to kind of address all of this Islamophobia that's been generated and cultivated around him and his.
Being a politician means listening, not just to your supporters, but your critics too. And some of these critics, especially on a certain website, have been giving me consistent advice. For example, at SamWhite087, Zohran, go back to Uganda, where you come from and belong. At Teflon Gone, loser, go back to Africa. There are thousands like this from across the country. I hear you. And I agree. I'm going back to Uganda. I'm headed there in a personal capacity to celebrate Rama and I's marriage with our family and friends. But I do want to apologize to the haters, because I will be coming back. And since you will undoubtedly read about this trip in the New York Post, inshallah on the front page, here are a few of my humble suggestions for headlines. MIA, Mamdani in Africa. Uganda miss me. He's completely crazy. He can't be serious. Carl Kampala-Neely investigates Mamdani. Zoe running away.
That was brilliant and a great way to end this. Thank you, Maha. That was also showing how humor is also so important when we talk about these issues. And I think what his campaign also does is that we are constantly given the language of division and polarization, and that's largely framed through identity. And what he does is bring it back to the issues. And that video also, he almost shows how ridiculous it is that some of the things that people say online, and he made a joke out of it. But also acknowledging that it is a serious issue too, that does have consequences. Thank you again, Maha, for sharing that. I think that was really a great way to end it. Again, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We will be publishing a recording of the event on our website, bridge.georgetown.edu. And thank you to our panelists for their brilliant presentations. Have a great afternoon, everyone.